also help each other get information in places where it couldn't. So Theodora was involved with an NGO that worked in the city center and was helping the refugees who were staying there, which kind of caused some frictions between, at one point, between the government and some of these NGOs. So, for example, she couldn't get the kind of information that I was able to get because I didn't have that sort of friction influence my conversations with the people we were interviewing. So, yeah, I think we can delve into Belgrade's situation a little bit more with our next question, but Teodora covered it pretty extensively.
Okay, great. So Marina, I really like your point about working with a local practitioner, and where you were, although you were sort of a local yourself in that you knew the city well, you were technically an outsider who came in and then were able to work with Teodora. Jessica, what about your experience in Hamburg? Can you tell us about your experience of doing this localized research there?
Yes, so I, as I mentioned earlier, was building off of an institutional connection between my university and actually a research group at a university in Hamburg. So one of the most important connections I made was actually that first connection where I went and the individuals who had already spent about 8 months working on this project of helping the local government identifying new housing sites through this new public engagement method. They were the first individuals to really explain to me what was going on, give me insight about the city and ways in which I could contribute on top of the research that was already happening. I, unfortunately, was not paired with a local researcher. I did much of this on my own, though I did have many interviews with residents, refugees, housing site managers, and I think that perspective has been critical to my understanding of what's going on in Hamburg. It's one thing, you know, the value of this RIT project is that it's one thing to do policy analysis and talk about how it's happening, but the value of this project is showing the result of those policies and the experience of what that means day to day in the lives of refugees who are living in these cities. So for me, that local engagement was critical to understand what it looks like in the day-to-day experience of someone who has been assigned to live in Hamburg.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jessica. Okay, so at this point, we want to talk more about our findings. The RIT project has 3 goals when it comes to findings. The first is that we want to map the city, and we've developed, through Charles's expertise, we've developed a set of mapping tools and a mapping approach, which we use to help our researchers to develop a map of the city, which kind of disaggregates the city so we can see where different migrant groups and refugee groups are living, where they're clustered or concentrated, and we're further developing this map to look at how this distribution of migrants and refugees relates to services on the map of the city. So one of our key findings is to develop a more detailed and disaggregated map. But the other 2 findings that I want to focus on now and ask each of our researchers is we have two main goals. The first is what impact has the migration, the refugee influx, the migrants, what impact have they had on the city? And we divide up this impact in different ways. We look at the impact on markets, housing markets, employment markets. We look at the impact on services, services for like education, health, and so forth. And we ask our researchers to give us a sense of what impact has happened. It doesn't mean that they do a full-on case of every single kind of impact. They may choose a particular goal or a particular sector to focus on, like housing or education, and so forth. So that's one, is what impact it's had on the city. And the second one is to look at how the refugees or migrants, what their experience has been, and also what the experience of the host population has been in trying to kind of work out this integration experience. So what I want to do now is ask our researchers to focus on the first, or rather the second, which is the impact of migration on the city. And I particularly we have the cases, they've gone into those in detail, but I want to ask our people to tell us to focus on something that they found particularly interesting or unexpected in their research. So when they were looking at the impact on the city, what did they find that they were not expecting or that was particularly salient or unexpected? Let's again start with Theodora and Marina to ask about the impact on Belgrade.
Okay, so the impact of larger refugee influx in Belgrade. For me, I particularly noticed the economic impact and the impact on consumption, especially in areas in Belgrade city center. So we've noticed like that this economic impact is manifested through new kinds of presenting some products, like for food, for example. Like we could suddenly notice restaurants that sell halal food in the city center, and we can notice some signs in Arabic or Farsi in this area. So it was something that didn't exist before in Belgrade, because really there were no these kind of cultures before. So yeah, we noticed also that on the local market, refugees started to resell some items, and this was also the way to interact with local population through consumption and through trading. Something that was really unexpected for me was the interaction between Roma population in Belgrade and refugee population in Belgrade. It's very interesting that Krnjača reception centers, because refugees in Serbia are mainly accommodated in reception centers and not in not in houses that they rent or something, but everybody are in reception centers. So the main reception center is Belgrade. In Belgrade is located right next to the Roma informal settlement. So there is basically only one fence that is dividing Roma population from refugee population, and we can really see these people that they are interacting on an everyday level, and not just through economy, but also through education, for example, because from 2017, refugee children started to go to schools, but somehow they're in classes with Roma children. So it's also important that we highlight the context, because Roma population in Belgrade, they're really they're living in poor areas, like in squatter areas. They are marginalized, and they are very vulnerable population, and they also kind of came by migration, for example, 1 decade ago. So for me, it was unexpected to see how much these two groups have in common in Belgrade, in this context, in context where others are located on the outskirts of the city, and they are somehow they're forced actually to be together. And sometimes we see that they're really good friends and that they have some deals or something like that, but we also can see that they are competing somehow, in this who will get more social help and humanitarian aid, etc. So it was something unexpected. Yeah.
And say more about this interaction between Roma and the refugees, how is that received by the local population in Belgrade? Is this seen as a, yeah, tell us how.
I don't think that they see it. I don't think that local population, non-Roma local population and non-refugee population, the Serbians, I don't think that they realize how much these two groups are actually integrating on an everyday level, because this reception center and this Roma settlements, they're generally really far from the city center. So when you go there, it literally looks like some other city. It doesn't look like Belgrade. So I don't think that people are aware of this still. Maybe no, I don't think they're aware of this. Yeah, but I saw it as a researcher, as an anthropologist, as somebody who is, I see these details maybe, but I don't think that other people do.
It's an interesting finding, and we see that in a number of our other case studies too. I'm thinking about Cairo, how the integration often happens between refugees and other hidden or disenfranchised communities within the city. It's not with the sort of upper echelons in any formal way, but there's a lot of connection going on between the other groups of urban poor and those kinds of things. Maria, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that another thing that was kind of interesting when it comes to unexpected findings is also sort of reactions of local populations, but they're not necessarily in Belgrade itself, because at first, like Theodora mentioned, the people necessarily didn't want to stay in Belgrade. It was a transition city, and so not many of them applied for asylum. And in addition to that, the government policy was to be very welcoming and to encourage people to help out rather than sort of protests like we saw sort of protests in European cities. So I expected that to be the case all the time during our research, because it was very clear from both sides that the migrants don't want to stay, that the host population necessarily doesn't want them to be there, or also cannot accommodate a large influx of refugees. But with time, this changed, and I think that's something that's sort of related to what you were just talking about, that the government insisted on sort of moving the people out of the informal settings, which also resulted in moving them out of the sight of the people in the cities and putting them in sort of outskirts of the big cities or smaller towns in Serbia, which then kind of resulted also in a little bit more of the organizing on the part of anti-immigration movements. And an unexpected thing was also move in of the European anti-immigration movement into Serbian kind of social and political scene, and trying to make sure that there's more activity in that area as well, which is something that I didn't think would happen, but I guess makes sense with the fact that people are stuck and staying in the country longer. So it's something to pay attention to in the future. And especially because in Serbia, about 1/3, I believe, of and about 2,000 migrants are unaccompanied minor, mostly boys, who are not enrolled in schools, who obviously don't have a legal status, cannot work, which again results in sort of, having to resort to illicit economic activities to sustain in the country.
Marina, I want to ask you, just push you a bit more, because you have done a lot of work on looking at how certain political groups in Serbia and in Europe have kind of mobilized around this issue of migration. Did you know, we're hearing this even on the news today, the BBC News talking about this group, the Knights Templar International, who are very mobilized in Serbia right now. And I'm wondering if you want to say anything about your observations about political mobilization around migration.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, yeah. So this is, again, something kind of unexpected in Serbia, but it sort of makes sense in this global crisis. But it is, I think migration has been serving as a platform for organizing for the sort of far-right and anti-immigration movements in Europe for a long time now, but we haven't really seen it in the Balkans and in Serbia in particular, because we have never seen influx of refugees from outside of the region. Most of the refugees in Serbia, which has a long history of accepting people, and came from Kosovo or Bosnia or Croatia, and they were mostly ethnically Serbian too. So, this kind of organizing around migration or anti-migration is something very new, and European movements and individuals who have been associated with these sort of like nationalist, radical organizations have found some kind of refuge in Serbia and have started organizing more, and partially because Balkans have been sort of prone to nationalism historically, but also because with the refugee crisis in Europe, it seems to be a good place to kind of reorganize, regroup, and strengthen connections to sort of attack this, quote unquote, European liberal project and protect. A lot of the Knights Templars International have moved in Serbia actually under the parole of Serbia protecting Europe from ISIS since 1389. So it's sort of revoking this Serbian nationalism and putting it in a European context and vice versa, which is something that hasn't been happening before, but it serves to connect the far-right movement globally and establish much stronger connections with Europe and Serbia, which is potentially really concerning.
Okay, great, Marina. I know you could talk more. Maybe we'll come back to that. We are joined now by our other panelist, Zeynep, who's joining us from Istanbul.
Yeah.
Before we go to Jessica, I just want you to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your research, who you are, and then your research in Istanbul and in Sultanbeyli in particular, and then we'll just keep it a little brief because we're in the middle of going to switch to Jessica again soon.
Okay. I'm so sorry about being late. I was in another meeting, another webinar. I'm Zeynep. I'm a PhD candidate at Northeastern University, and I've been doing research on refugees for 3 years now. And for the RIS project, I did a case study on Sultanbeyli, which is a town, like a small district located on the outskirts of Istanbul, Turkey. So as you all are familiar with, I guess, like Turkey is now the largest refugee hosting country. It's hosting 3.5 million Syrian refugees and more than 4 million refugees in total. And although many refugees are clustered around the borders, Turkey is a bordering state to Syria, 500,000 refugees live in Istanbul, in the largest city of Turkey. And Sultanbeyli is among the districts in Istanbul, where many, like the majority of the refugees are hosted, actually. And giving a little bit short background on Sultanbeyli, as I told you, it's a suburb on the outskirts of Istanbul. It's among the most impoverished districts of Istanbul. It has the lowest level of education. And what is interesting about Istanbul is that it has been the hub of migrants since the 60s. So whomever moves to Istanbul, either from within Turkey or from outside, Sultanbeyli is known as being the first destination to all kinds of migrants, including Bulgarian Turks, the Kurdish population moving from the southeast, and so on. And the thing about Istanbul is, it's a huge city hosting 20 million people in total. So, when we decided to do a case study on Istanbul, we realized that we can't study the whole city all at once, because, literally, it's kind of city that refugees, experience different things in each and every district. So each and every district has its own terms of integration and dynamics and livelihood conditions. So that's very brief introduction to my case study.
Okay, thanks, Dana. That's great. We're looking forward to hearing your views, but I want to go back to Jessica now. We're talking about some unexpected findings, particularly around the impact on the city. So Jessica, can you tell us about something that you found particularly interesting in Hamburg?
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to start by sharing that the first unexpected finding was actually the diversity of asylum seekers arriving in Germany. As many of us have probably seen on the news, or as the media would lead us to believe, we would believe that it's overwhelmingly comprised of individuals coming from Syria. And in 2015 and 2016, probably about a third of the asylum applications were from people coming from Syria. But there were several other countries that were highly represented, including Afghanistan, Albania, Iraq, Eritrea. And so the diversity of individuals who are arriving to Germany is much larger than what many media reports would lead us to believe. And that certainly has an impact on the integration experience for these individuals, as it is incredibly personalized, and the services and attention given to each of these individuals. As I mentioned earlier, the main domain of integration that I considered in my case study was that of housing. In Hamburg, the local government has a policy of mandatory dispersed housing. So what this means is that for individuals who apply for asylum in Germany and are registered in the federal system, they're first assigned to a federal state. So for those asylum seekers that are assigned to live in Hamburg, the local government completely manages the housing process, and there are refugee housing sites across the city that are exclusively reserved for refugees. Of course, this proved to be very difficult as the number of people arriving in Hamburg increased rapidly throughout the end of 2014 and into 2015. So the local government was required to do an extensive amount of construction. And in doing so, they added to the number of available housing sites for refugees. There are nearly 40,000 places available now for refugees in Hamburg, which is still short of the number of individuals requiring housing, but is a substantial step forward from the 12,000 spaces that were available at the end of 2014. So I think an unexpected finding is the impressive amount of construction that did happen. However, the interesting fact of this construction is that much of it happened under a new federal policy that built accommodation units for refugees in non-residential areas. These are intended to be temporary units, and they're built at a housing standard that's even lower than that of the social public housing standard in Germany. So a very interesting outcome of this is that the city has pursued a pretty significant amount of new construction over the past 3 years in order to provide accommodation for refugees across the city, which is an incredible commitment. But at the same time, this new construction is limited in the time span in which it can exist, and the housing standard is low enough, in fact lower than federal standards, so these units cannot be repurposed for other purposes. They can't become social housing units. They can't even become university dorms, as one of my interviewees was trying to explore this option. So there's been a huge economic commitment to new construction, though the time span and the life of these units is limited, given that they've been intended exclusively for refugees, and various legal restrictions restrict who and how long individuals can live there.
That's fascinating, Jessica. It's really an astonishing finding. I'm wondering how widespread it is across Europe that governments create housing that's sort of suboptimal in some ways and not repurposable, as you said. I would love to revisit this theme that you raised and others have raised too, and we're finding this across our case studies, which is the enormous diversity in the range of groups, the type of national populations, the different groups that are coming, different migrant groups that are coming into these cities. We have seen, and many of us have complained over and over about the inordinate focus on Syrians and to the neglect of other refugee populations. I'm hoping we can revisit this theme in each of your cities to see whether you've noticed this in particular in the areas that you focused on. Are Syrians getting more services, or is that not the case? Are services equally allocated amongst different refugees? How have host populations responded differently? This is a theme that we can revisit later. We now are going to ask Zeynep to address this question about a surprising finding that she experienced, that she found in Sultan Beyli. Particularly when it comes to the impact on Yeah, on the city, on the town. Go ahead.
Yeah. I can also start with making some comments on the theme that you just mentioned, like the discrepancy between the Syrians and the rest of the refugees. That's also the case in Turkey too. Syrian refugees in Turkey are covered under this whole temporary protection regime. Basically, they have free access to primary health services and education, public education facilities, and all kinds and sorts of things as well, while refugees from other countries do not, and that puts them in a very much more precarious situation compared to their Syrian fellows. And this somehow raises some grievances towards Syrian refugees among other refugees. And moving to the interesting findings that I discovered in Sultanbeyli is, first, if I start with Istanbul, what was most interesting about the whole city and how refugees change it, and how the city also manages the refugee situation, is that the discrepancy among the districts in terms of integration and service provision for refugees. So in one district, such as Sultanbeyli, one can see a full range of services provided for refugees, besides high social capital and solidarity networks established, while in other districts, this could be the otherwise. And one of the cases in which this is showcased is this ongoing battle on name tables right now. So Syrian business owners just start opening up multiple businesses all around the city now, and they would put up Arabic name tables to their shop. And now it's a bit contested that if they should put up Turkish, because Turkish alphabet is a Latin Turkish language. Like in Turkey we use Latin alphabet, but Arabic alphabet is different than that. So there's this ongoing battle going on if those name tables should be taken down or not. And you can easily observe in which districts those tables are welcome and in which districts they're not. So this is kind of one symbol that can tell you the levels of integration for refugees in each district. And Sultanbeyli is an exceptional case in that sense because both in terms of service provision and levels of integration, it's phrased so far as the best place to live for refugees. Although, as I mentioned before, it's among the most impoverished towns of the city. So municipality is making some great effort to serve refugees. They built a 5-story community center where refugees can get some primary health services, vocational classes, and there's even a nursery for kids so their moms can easily and freely participate in the classes, like either language classes or vocational classes. And on top of that, the social capital, my research actually focused, social capital was my focus point when I did my research. And the levels of social capital among the refugees and between the refugees and the host community is also very high. I think this is also because Sultanbeyli is known as the hub of Islamic charitable organizations. So this whole established network somehow welcomes refugees to the town too. And I think this ended up in a positive way, both for the host community and the refugees.
That's great. Thanks, Zainab. You also, when we first started, we were asking about localization and participatory research, having refugees not just providing their voices to findings, but actually more directly involved. Can you talk about the importance of you're originally from Istanbul, how that played into your research, having that local perspective, but then also pulling some Syrian refugees into your project to be more directly involved?
Yeah, of course. I'm Turkish and I'm born and raised in Istanbul, so this is my town actually. And although I don't live in Sultanbeyli, I have family and friends living there. So it wasn't a brand new field site for me when I first decided to do some research over there. And the best part about that was, I mean, the whole research process took me around 3 months, and the first almost the entire time in the first month, actually, I didn't do anything in the field site. I just went there and hang out with refugees. So that I think this whole trust building process helped me to establish some good communications and friendships with that. And the whole research actually ended up being co-directed with some of the refugee friends I made in Sultanbeyli, especially one, which I'm not going to make her name known here, I'm not going to make her name known here, but she helped me to build my research. She helped me to shape it, and she was an active participant to the research from the beginning to the end. So I can tell you that this whole experience taught me a lot in the sense of how to do participatory research. And maybe I can share one interesting anecdote on that. This friend of refugee friend, I can't speak Arabic. So that was one of the major impediments, me interviewing refugees. But thanks to, as I told you, some refugee friends I made, they helped me with the translations and the conversations and everything. And this friend, who was actually also fluent in Turkish, she said she prefers to speak to me in English because nobody else in that area could speak English except me and her. So this whole language switch actually kind of provided us some space of freedom to talk about anything we want. So that was really an interesting experience to me, which I wasn't expecting to find when I first went to the field.
That's great, Dana. It's so interesting to hear how our local researchers engage with each other and the role of language in all of this.
Yeah.
I love your anecdote. One thing I think we are really noticing in our project is how to incorporate or acknowledge or to give proper full acknowledgement to our co-researchers who are in the town, where sometimes it's not, the issue of anonymity and whether we should name our co-researchers and whether there are security issues around doing that is a big issue in many of these cities where we're working. And you've just noted that yourself, Dana, by not wanting to name your co-researcher, your local co-researcher.
Yeah.
That is also something we're finding across the board, and I'm sure an issue that many people are encountering in this, as security issues rise in these cities. So it's something that we just want to kind of flag there as something that we're trying to deal with on a city by city, local area by local area basis.
Yeah.
So I think at this point we can pause. We have some other themes to go over, but maybe open it up to questions from the audience on what we've covered so far. You can just enter it into your chat area, and I can read out the questions to the group. If you want to go ahead and do that now, if anybody has questions. While we're waiting, Zainab, do you want to, or waiting for questions to come in, Zainab, do you want to talk a little bit more in detail about how exactly your local friend was able to help you with the research process, more than just translating, but actually figuring out which questions make sense and which ones didn't, certain lines of inquiry to focus on that you may not have considered, a little more depth on that topic?
Definitely. I mean, first of all, when I met her, I mean, she agreed to be the gatekeeper for me to get an access to the field. But not only that, as we became friends, she also accepted that she wants to speak too. So that's I mean, there were I think I can easily say that there were multiple layers of our friendship and relationship, both as a researcher and a subject, and also as friends, and also colleagues at the same time. So I think that helped me a lot to enhance my view of the field site. Because if I didn't know her, I think, and also like most of my research, I don't know if you had chance to look at the report, you're gonna realize that most of my interviews were women. That's also because, like, first, I'm a woman, so women feel a lot more comfortable talking to me, and second, that my friend actually helped me tons to reach out to these women who actually like do not have any public voice. And most of the women whom I talked to were her friends or friends of her friends. That's how my circle kept growing and growing in the town. And also, she was working at the center that I was also working at, and like she introduced me to her colleagues there too, both including women and young men, which also like provided me some access. And besides that, it helped me to build some trust with those people, because like once she introduced me to other refugees whom I want to interview, then they perceive me as friends, and that's why our conversation becomes more of a colloquial nature, which I really enjoyed.
If others are wanting to talk more about this experience of working with local researchers, please jump in. But we'd like to switch now to a topic, a theme that is, I think, quite typical not only of the Balkans route, but in many other routes across sub-Saharan Africa, and even certainly across Central America we're finding too, which is the issue of whether these cities that we're focusing on, are transit cities, as we've been referring to them, or are they in fact not transit cities anymore? How could you all sort of think about how migrants and refugees have changed their view, whether they've changed their view about the cities that they're in, that you've studied, worked with them? Do people consider these to be transit cities still? Are they waiting to leave? Are they actually planning to go on to other destination countries? Or, as we've talked about, some refugees are actually returning or seeking to go back to other cities. What has been the type and level of mobility or non-mobility that you all have encountered in your refugee and migrant populations in these cities? We talk as if transit cities were sort of somehow a permanent kind of category, but I think many cities they shift from being transit cities to being, cities of final, where the journey ends, or maybe where the journey ends and return happens. So can you talk a bit about transit versus destination versus, cities from which return happens, each of you? Jessica, do you want to start? The view sort of Germany is often a destination country. Is Germany still a destination country? Are people moving back? What's been your experience?
From my experience, Germany is definitely still a destination country, though I think it's actually the movement within Germany that becomes the most interesting. As I explained earlier, there's a federally regulated distribution system for asylum seekers in Germany, which is quite technocratic. So once an individual applies for asylum in the country, they are assigned to live in a particular federal state. There are 16 across Germany. And there's now a new federal law that requires individuals to live in that same federal state for their first 3 years of permanent residency in Germany. So it's actually an internal border that's restricting freedom of movement for these refugees. So to me, and in order to continue receiving social services, individuals do have to obey that regulation. So to me, what's going to be very interesting is when the 3-year regulation ends for the first group of asylum seekers in Germany, where do they choose to move to? Do they choose to change federal states? Do they move towards cities? Do they move towards certain areas pursuing economic opportunities or social connections? So I do think that there is still an opinion that Germany is a destination country, though I think one of my fellow case study researchers may refute that in a moment. But for me, what's actually quite interesting is intra-country movement, given that there is this new internal border system that limits the freedom of mobility.
Jessica, that's super interesting to me because we were just talking to another of our case studies, which is in Aarhus in Denmark, and apparently Denmark also has this 3-year limited mobility restriction that the state imposes. And I must say I'm guessing, I don't know, but maybe elsewhere in Europe too. Is it your understanding, and I understand that as in Denmark and Germany, services, the provision of services is restricted to the area where you're registered, and if you move away from that area, you no longer have access to services. But my question is, do people move anyway? Are they willing to forfeit the services just so they can move, or is everyone, obeying and conforming with the state requirement pretty much uniformly? Do you have any insight about that?
Yes, I would say that definitely a majority of individuals do follow their assignments, though there is, every year there's a certain number of people who simply don't ever sign up to their assigned housing site. I would say, I would guess roughly in the 10 to 15% range, but I would need to follow up specifically on that. So there are definitely individuals who are choosing to prioritize other connections or opportunities over the service provision and this regulated residency requirement, which across Germany varies, because you could be assigned to Hamburg, which is a pretty bustling city with, limited affordable housing options, but definitely economic and employment opportunities, or you could be assigned to a more rural community in the western or eastern parts of Europe where there just aren't the same city lifestyles that perhaps individuals are used to. So I think that really impacts whether or not people follow their housing assignments.
Thanks for that, Jessica. What about the others? How about Marina, working backwards? Marina and Theodora in Belgrade. Is Belgrade a city of transit still? Or what is mobility looking like in Belgrade?
Yes, Belgrade is still a transit city, even though there are a lot of efforts by the government and by the European Union that it turns it basically to buffer zone. But for migrants themselves, they still perceive as a transit city. And but I have to emphasize that 3 of our let's say people that we talked to who are that we interviewed for several times, the 3 of them are asylum seekers they really got asylum and they really want to stay here, and now they want to open their own restaurant, and they're really they moved to a private apartment. So for example, yes, but they're maybe 1% of the total refugee population that actually wants to stay here, and the others, they're still perceiving it as a transit country.
Say that people they are blocked, right, from moving on further into Europe. So are people actually finding ways to move on, or are most people?
Yeah, they do move on through irregular border crossings with smugglers. So smuggling is really huge in Serbia. I mean, this whole topic about smuggling is it would need a special case study just for that. So, but yes, people are using these irregular ways to cross the border, even though they can't go on further legally.
And are you seeing anybody seeking to go back? I mean, voluntarily choosing to?
Honestly, no. I didn't meet anybody who came back. But IOM, for example, they are providing this service if somebody wants to go back, but they don't have a lot of people who really want to get back from Serbia there.
I think what's interesting about going back is that people are not necessarily going back to their countries, but they are returning to other European countries that they came to Serbia from.
Yes.
Yeah, so during our field research, we saw some decrease in numbers, and later again more people arriving in the fall. But during the summer, when we were there, a lot of people were going back or asking to be sent back to Greece, for example, because once they were in Serbia and they realized, it's really important to emphasize again that Serbia is really economically it's a very poor country. There's not very many job opportunities, which is primary reason why people don't want to stay there. And most of the research participants we spoke to listed that as the number one reason why they wouldn't want to stay. They didn't have many negative experiences with the local populations, and they actually had even liked the city. They said they befriended a lot of people they worked with in like refugee centers or community centers, but the problem was that they just didn't see their future there because there wasn't much to kind of build on, and they had a really difficult time finding jobs and such. So yeah, a lot of them, after the closure of the Balkan route, couldn't necessarily make their way to Croatia as they did before. Now we're seeing some people going down to Bosnia and then trying to make their way to Europe using other border crossings in the Balkans. But yeah, during last summer and probably now too, a lot of them asked to be returned or have tried to return to other European countries.
Yeah, I'll plug our pending Stuttgart and Athens case studies. Stuttgart did not have quite as a progressive housing policy as Hamburg, and we're seeing refugees there either informally moving throughout Germany or trying to move backwards along the route. And Athens is receiving a lot of those who got to elsewhere in the EU and then returned. Zeynep, do you want to talk about this? You're seeing in Istanbul a lot of refugees who made it to Europe irregularly and then came back.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely say a few words about that. Though early on in the crisis, Istanbul was referred as a transit city, I can totally say that now it's the destination, final destination for all kinds of refugees from all around the world. And considering the fact that there are more than 500,000 refugees living in the city, that many people, newcomers, refugees, call it home right now. And the interesting fact about Istanbul is, I met many refugees who actually have been to Europe and then decided to come back. There are many reasons for them doing so, including cultural discrepancies, or sometimes the language issue, or sometimes they just didn't like the idea of being too far away from their families. And most of them know that it takes forever for other family members to move along with them. So they, instead of waiting there for years and years and years, they just decide to come back. So these are among many reasons for them to come back to Turkey. And on top of that, except one, I think almost all my interviewees said they have no intention to go to Europe, neither in the near or in the longer future. They were all one day we definitely want to go back home, back to Syria, but they were all we have no intention to go to Europe or apply for asylum in Europe. They were either happy or satisfied about their life situations in Turkey, although they're going through really hard times. So that was my experience with, I think, going to Europe for now.
That's great. Thank you. We're running low on time here. We have one question from the audience, and I'd open it up to other questions. If anyone wants to type them into the chat area there, we can field them to the group. We have one question that is about the relations between host and refugee communities, whether there are tensions that exist, what the drivers are of those tensions, specifically in your cases. So yeah, let's take on that question.
How about Jessica? Did you notice tensions between the hosts, and the migrant groups?
Absolutely. I think that there is, certainly, it varies everywhere. There are certainly people who are incredibly supportive, but there are also individuals who are not as welcoming. Again, as I focused on housing, the anecdote I can share here is as it relates to the new construction of additional housing for refugees. As the city went about building additional housing facilities, local residents started putting up lawsuits against these housing facilities using kind of old and archaic land regulations, or saying a very particular tree was threatened. And those individuals that I spoke with in the government really felt that they were just kind of throwing out any excuse to prevent the construction of new housing facilities in their neighborhood. As we say, you know, not in my backyard, or NIMBYism, definitely happened in regards to housing. I think that it was not only for people who felt the pressures in their own neighborhood, but residents in Hamburg were also nervous about larger housing sites being built. So as time went on and the pressure increased, the city started proposing housing units that would have 2,000, 3,000 refugees on one given site. And there was a real mobilization of resident organizations against that, with the rationale that one site with that many people would prevent integration, because there would be fewer opportunities for engagement and interaction with local residents if so many refugees were living on one site. So I thought both, you know, as people were trying to prevent additional housing being built in their own neighborhood, and also fears of density of refugees that would threaten their ability to integrate in the society.
Jessica, that's so interesting. And as an expert in housing, you haven't actually mentioned where you're from. I don't know if you want to, but do tell us about your MIT roots as an urban planner. But in your experience, what would you say would be the optimal number of people in a housing unit, like, or, you know, these special purpose housing settlements, whatever you call them? Obviously 2,000 is a lot. Do you think, is there an optimal number, or can you give us some idea of what you think would be a better approach?
That's a really tough question. Thank you for asking it, because I think it's one we really need to consider. But I don't have a straight answer, to be entirely honest. 2,000 is a lot of people on one site, and there's a lot of academic literature and practitioners who debate the benefits or the detriments of so many refugees or immigrants living together in one neighborhood. You know, it strengthens social connections, and those can be used as a bridge to employment opportunities, but it can also limit the interaction with local residents and can, in fact, allow people to kind of build these parallel societies. So in terms of a given housing unit and how large it can be, I honestly don't have a direct answer to that. To me, the most important part about locating housing sites is actually their proximity and accessibility to other urban services. So in Hamburg, these housing sites started becoming further from existing residential neighborhoods. So that means they were further from transit stops. They were further from your neighborhood grocery store. They were further from education. So for me, the most important part, and I can't totally give an answer on size, the most important part of locating new housing is ensuring that these housing sites have equal accessibility and access to the urban services that any of us would want living in a city, equivalent to those of local residents.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that. How about let's move to Belgrade, about tensions between community, host population, the host society, and the migrants. You've talked a little bit about that, Marina, in terms of political mobilization around that. And you, Theodora, talked about the economic impact, which might also be called a cultural impact of these areas. Can you say more about whether there were any, what the relations were like between hosts and migrants in these areas where there are clusters of migrants?
Well, in the beginning, it was different because everybody thought that it's going to be temporary, you know, but now neighbors in, for example, Savamala area, in this area near the train station and bus station, they are getting more and more angry. Now they even built literally a fence between the building where these neighbors were complaining, and localized center where the refugees are, where I work. So they literally build a fence now. And yeah, that's how things are changing. But maybe Marina can also say something about that.
Let me ask you this: did the fence help or not?
Can it help? I mean, they still see us.
You know what they say about fences make good neighbors. Was that the case or no?
I don't know. They're really good neighbors. Yeah, but no, of course. I mean, if they're happy, I mean, I don't know, really. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. So that's how I met Teodora. So Teodora worked in Mitrovica, which is kind of a community center slash like a hub of different NGOs that provide assistance to the refugees. And they were very active when a lot of people were transiting through the city. And at that time, a lot of local people as well that live in these neighborhoods, in these buildings around the parks and this center, would come out and sort of help people bring out extra supplies, food, blankets, and Serbia was quite proud of that. The government was really pushing for that sort of empathy and humanitarian approach. And you know, as it became obvious that people will be staying longer, it became a problem both for the government and then for the local population, mainly because there were increasing numbers of incidents in the informal settlements. And there were some conflicts between the local population and the migrants, but mostly there were conflicts between different migrant groups and migrants and smugglers, which then provided sort of an argument for the local population to mobilize more around this issue and say, well, you know, we have to do something. These people need to go to a refugee center that is, or a government-provided accommodation. And then also it's important to mention that at this time, when the government is really pushing for people to get out of the city, it was winter. The places where the people were staying were really, and the conditions were really bad. It was very cold. So, you know, that also added to sort of like this increased sentiment of like, well, we need the people out of the city. But yeah, as Teodora mentioned, you know, with time and sort of this increased number of incidents, the local populations and the neighbors around started mobilizing more and complaining, and then became quite hostile also towards the aid workers in the city center. You know, when I came initially to Mitrovica, I've heard a lot of stories from people working there, but also from the refugees about sort of being attacked or yelled at the street and stuff like that. So that's something that's, you know, still happening and happening more too in smaller cities in Serbia. But in Belgrade, I think it's slightly, you know, it's sort of less visible now because there's less people, but it's sort of transitioning into this more political space and starting to talk about policy, because before that there was no conversation about it because, you know, people were not staying and that was it. But now it's clear that this might be a sort of protracted situation, so that the local population wants to kind of, quote unquote, protect itself or do something about it.
That's really interesting, and I think that's another value of this grounded approach that we're doing with this project is, Marina, you were tracking this sort of national level, very vehement anti-migrant rhetoric that was going out, but then to observe how it plays out in very complicated ways at the neighborhood level in terms of actual practical outcomes and lived experiences. That's fascinating to hear. Zeynep, do you want to you touched a little bit about points of tension, the language, Turkish Arabic being a point of contention. You want to briefly go through this, and then we'll look into wrapping up?
Definitely. Turkey, in that sense, is an interesting case. And I can say that there's a major clash between the host population and refugees. I think the Turkey's current government being very pro-refugee has a lot to do with that. And like, interestingly, for example, the Turkish elections are only 2 months ahead right now. And I can tell you from being in Istanbul for the last 2 days that refugee situation is not even topic of conversation. So this is a very interesting process to observe, I think, compared to what we had experienced with all kinds of European countries in the last 2 years and their elections, and how the refugee situations were emphasized as part of election campaigns. And there are, of course, some ad hoc incidents that are reported by media, mostly between employers and refugees. I can say that it's either like some fraud or some dispute over the salary, mostly on that. But what I observed in Sultanbeyli is actually the opposite. For example, between the homeowners and refugees, homeowners were actually like pretty much happy about refugees moving into the town, because I mentioned before, Sultanbeyli is a very impoverished town, and homeowners were really content with the fact that there is now high demand into the town, so they can rent their places easily with higher rent, of course. And but another thing I observed in Sultanbeyli, the disputes, the majority of disputes weren't between the host community and refugees, but among the refugees themselves over the assistance provided for them, either cash or some food assistance. So because they're like only limited resources, I can say that this sometimes can easily spark some conflict among refugees, because like all of them live in very precarious situations, and like even a bag of food makes a huge change in their lives to get by or getting by. So yeah.
That's really good, and I know in your report you go into a lot more detail about where these
Yeah.
points of tension are going. So to wrap up, we can, if we don't have any other questions from the audience, again, you can enter them in the chat. We have another couple minutes, but yeah, I encourage anybody who is in the audience to read through the reports. There's much more detail on all of this. We'll be doing sort of synthesized reports, again, comparing these cases. Next week, we'll be having on Wednesday morning at the same time a webinar with our Dar es Salaam, our Cape Town, and our Delhi localized researchers, going over themes of integration in developing countries in the global south, how that might look different than say, in Hamburg, where it's more formalized and structured. Did our panelists have any last-minute points of information real quick that we didn't cover already? I think that's it. Can I give the last word?
Yeah. Thanks so much to our panelists. We are trying to kind of group our cases together along the route. So like this is the Balkans route, which, as you know, has been closed. And our next seminar, we're going to look more at some of the sub-Saharan African routes and along with what's happening in India. And we are trying to kind of regionalize our discussion around this, but we'd love to have people's input and thoughts on how we can make our webinars more, how we can improve them, any thoughts you have, comments, and we'd love to see your involvement. Thanks so much to our panelists.
Thank you. And again, this is being recorded. We'll send this out to be listened to. And please distribute it through your networks. Thanks, everybody. Bye.